Well, it's now time for The World This Week. In partnership with The Daily Beast, I'm Sanam Chantier, filling in for François Picard. Now, this Friday, we're joined by two Paris-based journalists. We have, of course, Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of The Daily Beast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Of course, it's very quiet here in Paris in the summer months, but there's no stopping the world of news.
That's right. It's a very quick. The city is empty, but the news, the headlines are not empty.
Sadly not. And of course, Anne Bagger-Mary, independent journalist, thank you very much for joining us. Let's now kick off with U.S. sanctions against Iran, which took effect on Tuesday. And they're having an impact on everything from the currency to aviation to gold to even pistachios. Now, Donald Trump has called them the most, quote, biting punitive measures ever imposed. Iran's Hassan Rouhani describing them as psychological warfare while rejecting the US president's offer of talks.
Having negotiations at the same time as imposing sanctions is meaningless. If someone stands in front of his rival or his enemy, puts a knife against their arm, and then seeks talks, they will tell him that he should first put the knife away and then come back to the negotiating table with a sensible argument.
President Rouhani there speaking to state television earlier this week. Christopher Dickey, which is it? Are these the most biting sanctions ever imposed, or is it indeed psychological warfare, as Rouhani put it?
I think they're biting sanctions, but I don't think they're the most biting ever imposed. I mean, if you look at the sanctions that were imposed on Saddam Hussein, for instance, after the war in 1991, I think those were much more severe. But this is very hurtful to Iran. It's going to be very difficult. The economy suffered under sanctions for quite a while. Then it was relieved by the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, where Iran got back a lot of money and a lot of trade began. Now all that's being cut off again, and it's very painful. The question is, what's the end goal of this? The goal of Trump would seem to be to get Iran to back off all of its involvement in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. And that's not going to happen. Those are strategic interests for Iran, and it's not going to give up any of those places. And so where does this lead us? Eventually, it will lead us to a situation where Iran has to seriously reconsider restarting its nuclear program. And if I were an Iranian leader, and certainly if I were in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, I would think that's the only way Trump will ever respect us, is if we have nuclear weapons.
Now, Anne, the big question for you is, the point of this deal was, of course, to prevent Iran from advancing its nuclear program, and it achieves that, certainly by the standards of the international community. Why did Trump do this? Did he really want world peace, as he put it?
Well, okay, I'm not in the head of the U.S. president, but I will say we can know this much about him not being in his head, that if he makes a campaign promise, he's going to stick to it. And this was a campaign promise. It may not have been as vocal and obvious a one as building a wall on the Mexican border, but it was a campaign promise. It was also an initiative of his predecessor, Barack Obama. And for him and for his base of supporters in the United States, undoing Obama's signature initiatives has also been a pillar of the Trump presidency. So there's that. There's a domestic political advantage to what he's doing now. As for what it will mean for the Iran nuclear program, my guess is that indeed this will, as Chris has said, cause Iran to wonder whether it shouldn't just start and become a tough state the way some of the other tough states that Trump respects are, like North Korea. But it will also, it could also bring about a rethinking in some quarters of the other elements of the the accord that aren't addressed, such as ballistic missiles and Iran's regional aspirations. Will it cause the Iranian government to turn back on everything? Of course not.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has to be understood, especially about sanctions, is that if you have anything that's like a mafia state or a mafia government, and I think the IRGC would qualify in that regard, then they are strengthened by sanctions, because they're the ones who can control all the trade. Once you criminalize business, then the business becomes something that only criminals can control. And that is exactly what we're likely to see with the IRGC. I think I think Trump doesn't care or know, perhaps, how weak Rouhani really is and how much
he's been weakened as a result of
and
the JCPOA.
he's been made even more weak by this. So, yes, there's a supreme leader, but there is the IRGC, and there are lots of people, not just individuals, but collective leadership in the IRGC that is going to want to take a very hard line and that will benefit from the sanctions.
In fact, they're already benefiting because there are areas, I mean, the ordinary Iranian people who, let's face it, I don't think Trump knows about or cares about.
He claims to very much.
He claims to, but, it's the president's words. Let's take it at that. They're already suffering under these sanctions. They're suffering from infrastructure problems that nobody is really in a position or has the money to solve, except the Revolutionary Guard. There are places where towns don't have water, and people go into the streets to protest. The government slaps sanctions on the protesters, and the Revolutionary Guard comes in and builds the wells. So who are you going to be loyal to in that time?
It's interesting. You both made a point about saying that you think Iran will be left in a position where it would potentially have to or feel like it's cornered, so it has to resume its nuclear program. The Iranian officials, certainly up until this point, are saying if Europe manages to somehow salvage the JCPOA, then we'll stick by it.
Yeah, but that's like in Mexico, they say if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Europe has shown that it simply doesn't have the power to thwart this. Even China is going to have difficulties, although it's pretty clear that China will wind up getting a hell of a lot of oil, probably at lower rates from Iran.
As they did previously with the sanctions.
Sure, China is going to exploit this like crazy. Anne and I were talking about it before the show. You've got a situation where Trump is slapping sanctions on countries left, right, and center, and he's particularly slapping sanctions on countries that are going to turn automatically toward each other and particularly toward China for support. And, if he thinks it's a good policy for the United States to make China stronger by the day, maybe his base believes that, but I don't think that's particularly wise policy.
It does seem like, Anne, the Trump administration is under the impression that the maximum pressure campaign that it worked to in terms of trying to negotiate with the North Koreans will also be feasible with the Iranians. Do you think we are dealing with a leadership that's going to function in the same way as Pyongyang?
Almost certainly not. But if you look back in Iranian history, there have been other moments when the government in Tehran was under economic pressure from sanctions, and it did come to the table, and it did reverse on some of its previously held positions of insecurity, most notably when it came to the table to negotiate the current agreement, which is now in question. So anybody looking at history might conclude that this pressure could indeed bring Tehran back to the table. As for the parallel with North Korea, one of the best things I read preparing to come on here, and it was an op-ed in the Washington Post by Max Boot. And you know the one I'm talking about. He's a never-Trumper. He's not a supporter of the president. And his position...
Republican conservative.
And his position was, why did the Iranians refuse to have a North Korea-style reality show summit with Trump? Why not? If it would relieve the pressure a little bit, if it would make Trump feel as though he won something, that he looked like a big man up against a tough regime, why not do it?
You have to remember that Iran is a different country in that within itself the factions are fighting against each other, the so-called hardliners and reformists, and they didn't want the deal in the same way that the hawks in the U.S. didn't. So,
sure. I mean, first of all, Kim has absolute power. Mm-hmm. Rouhani clearly does not have absolute power.
Absolutely not.
But secondly, what's the great deal we got with Korea? There was no great deal with Korea, not at all. Denuclearization, wait, I'm sorry, what was it? It was a complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, and it was a done deal.
And prisoners.
Trump declared.
Remains, yes.
55 remains out of 5,300.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I said it was a reality show. I didn't say it was going to produce any tangible results.
No, but the question is, why on earth would anybody want to follow that? Well, from an American point of view, why would you want to negotiate like that? I can see you could say Iran should negotiate like that. Let Trump make a fool out of himself and then proceed.
It's one way of going.
But Trump is deeply in bed with the Saudis. And the Saudis are driving this train, as they are in many other ways. And we saw the way the Saudis react to all kinds of things. One little tweet about Saudi human rights, and they're all of a sudden withdrawing ambassadors, shutting down trade with Canada. I mean, they're completely nuts. And they're especially nuts on the subject of Iran. So I think that Trump basically is going to take the Saudi lead in this. And that's another dangerous and disturbing element.
And before we move on to the next topic, one thing that we've been hearing from some Iran observers is that protests, albeit rather sporadic ones across the country, are spreading because of the spiraling economic conditions, partly due to the failure of the accord. Do you think that could be part of the Trump administration's sort of end game? That's what he wants, regime change?
Well, on paper, at least, even Trump's most hardline advisors, like John Bolton, his national security advisor, is not saying that they want regime change. They want the regime to act in a different way. Now, protests on the street could potentially cause the Rouhani government to take notice and to modify certain elements of its behavior. But let's face it, this is not a regime that feels as though it draws its power from the people who are protesting. This is a regime that is focused very much on the capital, on elites, and on other people who already have power, not on the disenfranchised, not on the people without water, not on the religious, the people for whom the revolution was put in place in the first place.
I feel like we could devote the whole show to this, but we have to move on
let's
to the
devote
next
the whole show.
subject. Let's move on to the other story that's been grabbing headlines, though perhaps not enough, according to some media analysts, and that's, of course, the Indonesian island of Lombok, which was shaken by a third big earthquake in little more than a week, killing some 320 people. Now, local residents are still reeling from the devastation of the natural disaster.
Our next mission in our meeting with the villagers later is to discuss how we are going to build a temporary mosque so that the Quranic verse will continue to be heard throughout our village.
Family is everything for me. We can always find a new house in the future. We can stay healthy, and we will find a way to get an income.
Yes, we're terrified, but we have to go home and go back to work to feed the children. We can't stay in shelters forever.
Chris, the death toll continues to rise. It stands at 320 now.
I'm sure it'll go over 400.
156,000 displaced. How do you think this is being covered by international media outlets? Did we stop caring once the tourists and foreigners were evacuated?
No, I don't think the issue was the tourists and foreigners being evacuated. The fact is, maybe because of increased building codes, the casualty count as far as earthquakes go is low. It pales by comparison with Haiti, for instance, or Iran. I've covered earthquakes in Iran where 30,000 or more people were killed. Not to keep going back to Iran, but the question with any of these huge natural disasters like this is, will there be a political knock-on effect? Will there be a sense that the government was inadequate, that the corruption was behind it, that there were difficulties in that respect? I haven't seen any coverage that suggests there's going to be a long-term impact from this particular earthquake. And I think that's one reason that there hasn't been that much coverage. The numbers have been relatively low. There isn't a conspicuous political component. And if you've covered earthquakes where tens of thousands of people have died, you say, well, I'm sorry for these people, but in the great scale of things, Lombok got off fairly easily.
Sad to say, but Anne, can the scale of destruction in a developing country like Indonesia be managed, given that they do have problematic infrastructure, do you think?
There is an element of this story, then, and Chris, you mentioned the building codes, that is tied into something that might be a greater concern in the developing world, and that is whether building codes are enforced on the local level. Indonesia reinforced its building codes at the national level in 2011, probably in response to the earthquake and tsunami in Thailand, in the whole region in 2004. But local authorities, apparently, from the reporting I've read, do not feel obliged to respect the national codes. One reason, perhaps, that the death toll is concentrated in the local population and not in the tourist population, which was residing in newer structures built according to the national codes. So that is a very pertinent local story that is taking place in Indonesia and is, let's face it, probably taking place in other countries as well.
Lastly, Chris, we say it's a local story, but you have Indonesia that's attempting to at least contribute to infrastructure projects in Niger, but not focusing on its own issues.
Well, yes, but I think we see that all the time. You can look at the United States or any of a number of countries that can be very active overseas and ignore terrible, terrible problems at home.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. It was very brief indeed. Well, I'd like to thank Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of the Daily Beast, and of course, Anne Bagomeri, independent journalist. Thank you very much for joining us on The World This Week, and thank you for watching.